Let me ask you a question that might sound strange at first. What if the most powerful version of you isn't found in a crowd but in a room alone with no one watching? That's not what we're taught. From the time we're young, we're told to socialize, network, collaborate, stay connected. We're told that isolation is dangerous, that being alone is unhealthy, that solitude is something to avoid. But what if that's a lie? Or at the very least, a half-truth? What if solitude is not the enemy of power but the source of it? You see, we live in a world that is addicted to noise. Notifications, opinions, comparisons, validations. It never stops. And as men, we're constantly measured by how loud we can roar in public, how visible we are, how connected we seem, how productive we appear. But here's the secret no one tells you. The men who have built the deepest strength, the fiercest clarity, and the most unstoppable presence did it in solitude. Not once, not occasionally, but habitually. They chose isolation not as an escape, but as a forge.
Click subscribe to this channel to get more profound insights.
Think of Marcus Aurelius, Roman emperor and Stoic philosopher. One of the most powerful men in history, ruler of an empire. Do you know what he did in solitude? He wrote in a private journal his meditations not for anyone else, but for himself. That journal has shaped the minds of millions. But it was born from stillness, from silence, from confronting the self without distraction. So the question we're really exploring today is this: why does solitude turn men into powerhouses? And why are so few of us brave enough to choose it? Let's start with the first layer, identity. When you're always surrounded by people, your identity becomes reactive. You shape yourself based on how others perceive you. You start asking, who do they want me to be? Instead of who am I really? And over time, that question gets buried under performance. You become a reflection of the world, not a creation of your own soul. But in solitude, all the mirrors break. There's no one to impress, no one to perform for, no algorithm to chase. And that's terrifying because it forces you to confront the raw material of you. No filters, no roles, just the man you actually are. And that's where real power begins. Because once you know who you are when no one's watching, you become unshakable when everyone is. Now let's go deeper. Solitude doesn't just reveal identity. It refines clarity. In a world full of noise, clarity is a superpower. Most people don't think they react. They scroll. They copy. They imitate. But the man who chooses solitude learns to think for himself. He learns to sit with uncertainty, to hold questions without rushing for answers, to observe his own reactions, his own fears, his own desires without running from them. Here's a question you probably haven't asked yourself. When was the last time you sat in silence for an hour and just watched your own mind? No phone, no music, no distractions. Just you, your thoughts, and the truth. Most men never do this. Not because they don't want to, but because they're afraid of what they'll find. But here's the twist. The fear is the path. Because behind that discomfort is depth. And behind that depth is dominion. The man who can sit with his own chaos and not run from it. That man is dangerous. That man is free. Now, let's talk about energy. Most people think solitude drains you. But that's because they confuse solitude with loneliness. Loneliness is being alone and wishing it were different. Solitude is being alone and knowing it's sacred. And when you enter solitude with intention, not as punishment, but as practice, you begin to realize something wild. Solitude doesn't drain you. It charges you. Think of it like this. Every time you're with others, a small part of your energy is spent managing perception, managing expectations, navigating noise. But even when you're not performing, you're still processing. But in solitude, that energy has nowhere to go except inward. And when it flows inward, it begins to build. It begins to refine. It begins to concentrate. And what results is presence. Not loud, not aggressive, but magnetic. The kind of presence that doesn't need to speak to be felt. Let me give you a practical example. Have you ever met someone who says very little, but when they walk into a room, everyone notices? That's not charisma. That's concentration. That's the result of inner work. That's power that's been cultivated, not displayed. But solitude doesn't just give you presence. It gives you vision. When you're always around people, your thinking becomes short-term. You react to the day. You respond to the moment. But in solitude, your timeline stretches. You begin to see beyond the next hour, the next week, the next paycheck. You begin to ask, what kind of man do I want to be 5 years from now? 10? What kind of legacy am I building? Not just a lifestyle. And suddenly your standards rise. You stop needing quick wins. You stop chasing applause. You start playing the long game. And men who play the long game, men who are okay being alone while they build, those men win. Not because they're better, but because they're unbothered. Now let's address the real tension. Solitude is not easy. In fact, it's brutal. It strips away all the distractions you secretly use to avoid yourself. But that's the point. Solitude is not comfort, it's confrontation. And confrontation is where transformation begins. You want to become a powerhouse. Then ask yourself this: what parts of me have I been avoiding because I've been too busy being social? What fears, insecurities, unhealed wounds have I buried under noise? And what would happen if I stopped running and just sat with them? Not to fix, not to judge, just to witness. Because witnessing is the beginning of wisdom. And wisdom is the currency of kings. Solitude is not the withdrawal of life. It's the deepening of it. And when you choose it intentionally, not reactively, you begin to realize that everything you've been chasing externally already exists internally. Focus, discipline, purpose, peace, power. It's all in there. But it's buried under noise. And the only way to reach it is to be alone long enough to hear it whisper. So here's the challenge. Not tomorrow, but not next week. Now, take 1 hour, just one. Sit in silence. No phone, no music, just you. And ask yourself, who am I without the world's noise? Who am I without validation? What kind of man do I become when no one's watching? And if you're brave enough to stay in that space longer than is comfortable, you'll begin to feel something shift. A quiet strength. A deep stillness. A kind of power that doesn't need to be shown because it is. That's the beginning. That's the forge. That's the path. Let's step into the fire now, the part of solitude no one glamorizes, but everyone who's ever become great has walked through. You see, solitude isn't just about silence. It's not just stillness or peace or quiet reflection. That's what most people imagine. But the deeper truth is this: solitude is a forge. And the forge doesn't comfort you. It burns you clean. It melts the weak parts of you. It exposes everything soft, reactive, unformed, and asks a brutal question: are you willing to become something unbreakable? Because that's what solitude is really about. It's not about escaping the world. It's about preparing to re-enter it with something the world can't take from you. And that something is discipline, purpose, and focus, 3 things that every man thinks he has until he's left alone and realizes he doesn't. Let's start with discipline. In solitude, there's no applause. No one claps when you get up early. No one congratulates you for sticking to your plan. No one sees the reps you do in silence. And that's the point. Because every time you act without reward, you strengthen an invisible muscle, self-command. Not motivation, not hype, but command. The ability to give yourself an order and obey it. Ask yourself this: how many of your actions are driven by external pressure, and how many are chosen in your own authority? If everything you do is because someone's watching, or because there's a deadline, or because you're afraid of falling behind, then you're not disciplined. You're conditioned, and a conditioned man can be manipulated. But a disciplined man, he's untouchable, because he acts from principle, not pressure. Solitude trains that. It removes the scaffolding of social validation and forces you to build something stronger, inner law. If you say you'll wake up at 5 a.m. and no one would know if you didn't, will you still do it? If you say you'll write, train, study, build, and no one's there to check, will you still execute? Most won't, but the few who do become lethal, because they've learned to govern themselves. And a man who governs himself can govern anything. Now let's talk about purpose. Most people think purpose arrives in a dream or a flash of inspiration or some cosmic sign. That's nonsense. Purpose isn't something you find, but it's something you uncover. And uncovering requires digging, and digging requires time, stillness, and reflection. In other words, solitude. You can't discover your purpose if you're constantly reacting to the world. But you can't hear your inner voice if the outer noise never stops. How can you know what you stand for, what you're building, what you're meant to do if you never pause long enough to ask? Solitude gives you space to ask, what do I actually want? Not what I've been told to want, not what everyone else wants, not what looks good, but what resonates in my bones. And here's where it gets deep. Real purpose is painful. It will demand something from you. It will expose your laziness. It will require sacrifice. It will force you to say no to 90 good things so you can say yes to one great thing. But that kind of clarity only comes when you've stripped away everything artificial. And the only environment strong enough to strip you clean is solitude. In solitude, there are no distractions to numb you. You can't scroll your way out of purpose. You can't binge watch your way into clarity. You have to sit in the fire. You have to feel the discomfort of not knowing. And then you have to listen. And if you do that long enough, something begins to emerge. A vision, a direction, a sense of why. And once you lock onto that, why you become unstoppable. Because now your actions are not random. They're aligned. Now your pain has context. Now your suffering has shape. Now your work has weight. And that brings us to the third piece, focus. Focus is a dying art in our generation. We live in a time where attention is currency and everyone is trying to steal yours. Apps, ads, opinions, trends, all engineered to keep your mind fragmented. And the more fragmented you are, the more powerless you become. Because a fractured mind cannot create. It cannot lead. It cannot build. Solitude is the antidote. When you train yourself to be alone, you're not just protecting your time, you're reclaiming your mind. You're pulling your attention back from the chaos and sharpening it like a blade. And once your attention becomes sharp, you begin to see what others miss. You notice patterns. You anticipate problems. You detect nuance. You become a man who doesn't just react to reality, you shape it. Let me ask you something. When was the last time you focused so deeply on one task that time disappeared? No multitasking, no checking your phone, just you and the task. That state of flow, that immersion, is where genius lives. And you don't get there by accident. You get there by training your mind in solitude. You get there by making focus your default, not your exception. And the power in that is enormous. Because once you control your focus, you control your life. Think about it, everything you want exists on the other side of focus. Mastery, wealth, strength, wisdom. None of it comes from speed. All of it comes from depth. And depth only exists when you stop scattering yourself across 1,000 distractions and start pouring yourself into the one thing that matters. So here's the truth. Solitude is not a retreat. It's an advance. It's where you train discipline that doesn't bend. It's where you forge purpose that doesn't flicker. It's where you develop focus that cuts through noise like a sword. But there's one last layer we need to explore. The one that separates those who dabble in solitude from those who become something new through it. And that's the transition from being alone to being aligned. Because eventually, if you stay in solitude long enough, something extraordinary begins to happen. The fire that once burned you begins to illuminate you. The silence that once scared you becomes your center. You stop fearing your own thoughts. You stop chasing external validation. And you start becoming the kind of man who doesn't just survive the world, he leads it. So let me leave you with this question, and I want you to sit with it in your next hour of solitude. What kind of man are you becoming when no one's watching? Because that man, the one who's forged in fire, not applause, is the man the world is waiting for. You've walked through the silence. You've sat in the fire. You've stripped away the noise, the distractions, the false identities. You've faced your own mind, your own fears, your own unfiltered truth. And now you emerge. You step back into the world not as who you were, but as something entirely different. You are no longer reactive. You are no longer dependent. You are no longer scattered. You have become sovereign. And what does that mean? Sovereignty is not about control over others. It's not about power in the traditional sense. It's not about domination or superiority. It's about self-rule. It's about becoming the kind of man who governs his mind, his time, his energy, and his impact with precision. It's about walking into a chaotic world and remaining unmoved, not because you're numb, but because you're anchored. Let's be honest, the world is full of noise, and most men are drowning in it. They're pulled in a dozen directions, addicted to validation, outsourcing their self-worth to algorithms and opinions. But the sovereign man, he's different. He doesn't chase trends. He doesn't beg to be seen. He doesn't need to be included, because he knows who he is. And that knowing, that inner certainty, is the rarest form of power on earth. So what happens when a man like that returns to society? He doesn't blend in. He stands out. But not because he's trying to. He stands out because in a world obsessed with more, he radiates less but better. In a world addicted to speed, he moves with intention. In a world lost in performance, he embodies presence. And this is where the real magic happens. Because once a man becomes sovereign, his very existence becomes instructional. People want to know, how is he so calm under pressure? How is he so clear when everyone else is confused? How does he make decisions without fear? How does he walk into a room and change the temperature without saying a word? The answer is simple. He earned it in solitude. You see, the sovereign man doesn't need to dominate. He doesn't need to convince. He doesn't even need to explain. Because he's living proof that there's another way to exist. A deeper way. A stronger way. A way rooted not in the noise of the crowd, but in the silence of self-mastery. And this is where everything flips. Because the man who once withdrew to become strong now returns to serve, not to preach, not to perform, but to live in such a precise, aligned, powerful way that others can feel what's possible just by being near him. He becomes a lighthouse, a signal, a living argument for depth in a shallow world. But here's the paradox: the world may not celebrate him. In fact, it might resist him, because sovereignty threatens systems. It threatens conformity. It threatens mediocrity. When you meet a man who has true inner freedom, it forces you to confront where you are still a slave to fear, to distraction, to comfort. That confrontation is uncomfortable. So people might reject it. They might mock it. They might try to explain it away. And yet, they can't ignore it. Because deep down, every man knows this is who I was meant to be. Not reactive, not scattered, not desperate for approval, but clear, focused, disciplined, rooted, dangerous not in violence, but in presence. Let me tell you a story. There was once a warrior who left his village for a year. No one knew where he went. They speculated maybe he was broken. Maybe he had failed. Maybe he'd run away. But when he returned, he didn't explain. He didn't speak loudly. He simply walked differently. He looked people in the eye. He said less, but he did more. His presence calmed the anxious and unsettled the arrogant. And over time, people began to follow not because he asked them to, but because he became someone worth following. That's the power of solitude. It doesn't just build better men. It builds leaders, not by charisma, but by alignment. And alignment is magnetic. Now, let's get brutally practical. You don't need a cabin in the woods. You don't need to disappear for a year. You don't need to become a monk. You just need to create space. Real space. Space to feel, to think, to confront, to plan, to listen. You need to carve out time where the only voice that matters is your own. And then you need to honor what that voice tells you. Maybe it tells you to leave the job, but maybe it tells you to fix the marriage. Maybe it tells you to stop lying to yourself about what you're capable of. Whatever it says, listen. Treat it like sacred instruction, because it is. And once you've listened, act. That's the final test. Solitude gives you clarity, but clarity without action is just fantasy. The man who becomes sovereign doesn't just think deeply, he lives accordingly. And that's what sets him apart. That's what makes him dangerous. Not his muscles, not his money, but the fact that he knows what matters and acts like it. So here we are. You've heard the call. You've seen the forge. You understand now, solitude is not weakness. It's not loneliness. It's not retreat. It's the birthplace of power, and the man who chooses it intentionally, consistently, unapologetically becomes something the world can't predict, control, or replace. You become a force, a standard, a sovereign, and you don't need anyone to recognize it, because the way you move through the world says everything. So I'll leave you with one final question, one that might follow you for the rest of your life. What kind of man would you become if you stopped needing the world to see you and started living like the world needs you? That answer is waiting in solitude.